Welcome to the State of the Nation. My name is Henry SSALI for the African Alumni Association. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto African Alumni Association operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to work on this beautiful land. Again, my name is Henry SSALI, and I want to welcome you officially once again to the State of the Nation. I hope you are as excited as we are.
This is the State of the Nation. Rifa Mwanga. We are deliberate, we are reasonable, we are uncensored. The State of the Nation with Henry SSALI.
Yes. Welcome aboard, my usual comrades. George, the world, Wilobo. We are excited to have you. Mitala Muzukulu Muswangali, we are excited to have you. Dr. Stella, we are excited to have you as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone who is following us online. My name is Henry SSALI. Of course, you can always follow us on Facebook as well as on YouTube and Periscope as well as Twitter. Tusanyuse mwena okubalaba abatufollowinga mwebale nnyo mwebale ddala okuba nti no mutufollowinga bino byebifa mu ggwanga. Tuli basanyufu okulaba nti no mutujoyininze okubeera nga tunyumyamuko ku bikwata ku ggwanga lyaffe Uganda. Olwayo tugenda ku perspective ya Africa. Twogera nnyo about democracy church. Abantu abasinga abamu abadde bafollowing ebibadde bifa mu South Africa mulabye nti nno mubadde wegenda mu maaso week eno yonna ng'era byali sparked by the arrest of all right, Dr. Stella, you are appearing twice, which is good. We are delighted to have you back. Yeah, before I give the real preamble, I think let me invite Mr. George Wilobo to introduce himself. Unmute yourself and yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is George Wilobo, and hello to my fellow panelists here. Stella, good to see you. You're looking very smart. And Muzukuluamu, that word is very difficult. I'm going to practice seriously, but good to see you, my brother.
Muzukuluamu Wangari.
I will bite my tongue. So
I want to see that tongue bitten.
So I'm delighted to be on this platform and to provide any productive analysis of what takes place in our land. And with that, I would be delighted to be joined by anyone that is online and everywhere that they are watching and or listening from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wilobo, the world. Muzukuluamu Muswangali.
Yes, mwami Henry SSALI, omusajja ow'enkima. Nsanyuse nnyo. A great pleasure for me to be here. As always, Julius Mitala is my name. I go by the name Mitala Muzukuluamu Muswangali. I'm pretty sure today we must be having a lot of audience because I've seen Henry tagging all the big powers to be in the country in such a very hot and deliberate conversation. So I hope we shall be joined in the, in a conversation that will be informative, that will be educative, and that will also be revealing, for lots of our people who are following us from across the globe, and particularly in Kampala, Uganda. I've got no big introductions to make. I'm a regular here. If anybody has any questions, feel free to fire away, and I'll be happy to, give you some credible and honest answers. I always like to be somebody with an honest face. I give you an honest answer to an honest question. So I welcome the conversations as always, Henry, and I hope we're really going to have a very delightful conversation for today.
All right. Thank you so much, Muzukuru wa Mutwangali, and our very own Nalongo Owene, Dr. Stella Nyanzi.
Hi, Henry. Hi, Muzukuru wa Muswangali. Hi, George. It's a pleasure to return this evening and discuss with you. I am the regular who left and has returned, and today I'm in Munich in Germany, so I'm delighted to still participate and discuss Africa, discuss Uganda, discuss home from my location outside home. And so thank you, Henry, for organizing this panel once again. I look forward to the discussion.
This is the state of the nation. Rifa Mwanga. We are deliberate, we are reasonable, we are uncensored. The state of the nation with Henry SSALI.
Of course, you can always join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Kampala. 6 p.m. Kampala. The reason why I put 6 p.m. Kampala is so that I can enable everyone around the globe to ensure that they can adjust their times accordingly. Abali Munich bategere sawa. 6 p.m. Kampala zibera ziti in Munich. Abali Toronto bategera 6 p.m. Kampala zibera zitia. Toronto, 6 p.m. Kampala, zibera zitia London, 6 p.m. Kampala, zibera zitia Australia, or China, or wherever you are. 6 p.m. Kampala, the state of the nation. Of course, this week, as I told you earlier on, we are interrogating the concept of democracy in Africa. Specifically, we are trying to see the relations within what is going on in South Africa, which is perceived to be a stable democracy, and Uganda, which most people, specifically some scholars, have termed it as a dictatorial democracy. Of course, they call it a dictatorial democracy with rationale that given the fact that we engage in an electoral process every 5 years, which is not necessarily the fairest. That's where some people decide to call it a dictatorial democracy. All right. So, what do we have to investigate today? Of course, the people who have been following the conversation in South Africa, this week we have had a couple of, you could say, protests, riots, looting. There's a lot of events that have been going on. But without any further ado, I'm going to play a video. Of course, these stories were captured by Al Jazeera's Fule Batibo and Famila Mara. So I think they do have, they are more authoritative than I am because they had someone on the ground. So I'm going to play one of their clip to give us a context of what is going on and why it is important for us to discuss this conversation.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuliba Thibault. It's some of the worst violence South Africa has seen since the end of apartheid in the 1990s. There have been days of protests, looting and rioting across the country. Although it was sparked by the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma, the crisis has exposed the deeper issues of poverty and inequality. Angry crowds have looted shops, burnt down businesses and disrupted supply chains. There are fears now some areas could run out of food as a result. At least 72 people have been killed and hundreds arrested in nearly a week of unrest. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this update from Famida Miller in Johannesburg.
This is Alexandra Township in the north of Johannesburg, where we've seen significant looting and rioting over the past few days, specifically down this road where businesses were looted. Many of the buildings here were set alight. There has been a significant police presence, but really not enough to stop these incidents of looting. The army has been deployed. We don't see them here today, but it's thought that perhaps soldiers on the ground has managed to calm the situation, at least to some extent. And just behind us, we're seeing business owners and community members now returning here to try and assess the damage, also potentially clean up and try to restore some sort of calm. But really, it's too late, and the government is facing a lot of criticism for acting too late. Many South Africans, many organizations saying more should have been done early on, especially given that there were warnings immediately during and after the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. Now, it's his arrest and imprisonment that sparked some of the riots we saw specifically in KwaZulu-Natal. They've now spread to the province of Gauteng. And while it was that incident that might have sparked the riots, that's now morphed into more than just the political situation and the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma. We are seeing rioting and looting specifically linked to the economic situation in South Africa, where people here say COVID-19 lockdowns have left them desperate. They've lost jobs, they can't get jobs, and this is why we've seen businesses looted. People are desperate, and there are concerns around this increasing socio-economic challenges that the government is facing. And while the deployment of soldiers and police might quell protests for now, there's greater concern that if those challenges aren't adequately addressed and resolved, South Africa may continue to see similar uprisings and unrest. Famida Miller for Inside Story, Johannesburg.
That is Famila Mala for Inside Story. Of course, the question now is whether Famila Mala's story resonates with what happened in 1988. So some of you may be asking themselves, what do you mean? What happened in 1988? In 1988, there was a speech made by Peter William Botha. At the moment, he was the president of South Africa. Of course, in one of the comments he made, he said that black people cannot rule themselves because they do not have the brain and mental capacity to govern a society. He continued and said that give them guns, they would kill themselves. Give them power, they will steal all the government money. Give them independence and democracy, they will use it to promote tribalism, ethnicity, bigotry, hatred, killings, and wars. President Botha said. Was he right? Why don't we start the conversation with that? Was President Botha right? Wilobo, why don't we start with you in this conversation?
Well, thank you very much, Henry. in the context of that speech, don't forget that it was made at a time when Africa, there was very many civil wars and civil unrest in Africa, and most countries were still also grappling with independence and trying to free themselves from colonial regimes and rules. So at the time, of course, that speech meant a lot, and over the years, it has come to resonate with the current situation where people kill themselves for very selfish gains, and the leaders who are supposed to be the custodians of law and order, the custodians of good governance, they shed blood to stay in power. But I want to also contextualize the same speech with the fact that most of the African countries and powers that we have, they are foreign. Most of, like, even when we look at democracy itself, it's foreign. We adopted it from the colonial masters and the colonial rules that we had previously. And this, of course, sometimes have loopholes in terms of adoptions. And most of the things that we see today are actually as a result of the colonial era. From the colonial era to date, some of the mistakes that were adopted from the colonial time is still with us to date. And if I may jump into the what sparked that very speech itself, it's mostly the attitude of Africans not to believe in themselves as good ambassadors of peace and ambassadors of good governance. It has shaped a lot of mindsets in terms of how people perceive power, how people perceive leadership, and how people perceive regime change in Africa. Now, post-colonial times had its own mistakes, and it had its own strength, and of course its own jubilations that people had. However, some of those, if you look at, for instance, South Africa that we have today, between 1948 and 1994, that was all apartheid, and it is completely mad with a lot of injustices. And you would not imagine an African at that period or at that time to think differently, other than to have a machine or an equipment or any means to be able to fight for their freedom. So to speak specifically to that speech, to shed that kind of to profound in that speech, it's more to do with at the time. But still, we in the current situation, we also grapple with a lot of situations that causes the people to rise up against the oppressions, because at the time the oppressions were because from the colonial masters, slavery, and also the aspects of inflicting foreign rule onto Africans. But today it's our own Africans who are oppressing Africans. So in that instance, you have people who are angry, and the anger, of course, causes people to do anything.
All right. Mitala Muzukuru wa Musangali, you a legal mind. What's your perspective on this?
Thank you very much, Henry. I think first of all, I want to be clear that I do not condone violence or vandalism or looting or any kind of, nasty kind of images that we've seen coming from South Africa. I think wherever those sorts of things have happened elsewhere, there has been the widest condemnation, because obviously it wrecks economies, it wrecks lives, it wrecks businesses. It kind of shatters, our image as human beings, as a people, and it tends to thrash this light on us to paint us in a very, very negative kind of, in a very negative context. And I think the news that we are getting from the foreign press is not very, very palatable, if I should put it that way. So I condemn, the kind of images that we've seen coming from South Africa. They are not necessary. And I hope that, a solution can be found whereby we don't have to pit ourselves against each other, for survival in context of things of such a kind. The second thing I want to say is that I really don't want to give a voice to people who were blatantly racist, people whose objective, whose mission in life was to put the African race down completely. I mean, the sorts of people that we are referencing here, President Botha of South Africa of that time, I think, for lack of better words to say, I think he was a horrible man. He was an absolute racist. And I think his idea of, Africa independence was an African independence where the voice and the face of the black man was non-existent. So I think for me, it's kind of very, very uncomfortable. And I would rather, not give such an individual, a platform of this kind, to celebrate anything. And I'm not saying that we are celebrating it. Of course, I perfectly understand the context in which, the argument is developed. But I think personally, I'm just not comfortable, looking at those sorts of people as our points of reference, because we've got lots of, people from whom we can get inspiration from, people who actually represent us as people, and people who do not kind of look us, who do not try to put us down as human beings. So those are just two observations I wanted to make on that particular issue. But I think, of course, looking at what has happened in South Africa, it's pretty disappointing, but in a way, it's also understandable. Where you have a state that is collapsing, those sorts of things are not they are not surprising, because I think the politics of South Africa has got very serious problems at the moment. They are social problems, they are economic problems, and they are political problems, and these are all kind of being bandaged together. And of course, the toxic, they present such a very, very toxic environment, such that whenever they get a spark to be able to to turn into something that's very, very nasty, as the sorts of things that we've seen, it wouldn't be very surprising. But I think for me, what this really comes down to is it's the people who have been left behind. One of my friends some time ago made an observation, and he said, and I wanna put it exactly in the context that he put it. He said, abagagga we baba nga beezimbako ebisenge ne balowooza nti bajja kuba bulungi, nga mu backyard yaabwe there are millions and millions of desperate poor people. I think those kind of castles those people are building for themselves, they're not going to be lasting. They won't present lasting solutions for peace and democracy going forward. But there are some very fundamental problems in there. I think for me, what I see here is that constitutionalism is being put at test, and I think the South African constitution, the South African state, the South African enterprise is one that has been described as one which is a strong, that presents a strong institutional state strength, as opposed to a one-man kind of strong man, strong state. So we have a state here which is governed on institutions, and we've got states that are governed on one-man kind of approach. I think the South African institution is one which features a lot of institutions, and I think what they are trying to do here is they are trying to make sure that no individual is above the institution, and no individual is stronger than the state. And I think for me, from the broader context of things, that is really the main point that I would want to derive from this conversation today.
All right. Thank you so much, Muzukuru wa Muswangali. Dr. Stella, your perspective.
Right.
Should we justify Botha's comments in this speech, or should we completely condemn his racist remarks and his notions of promoting apartheid in South Africa at the time? And what do we learn from the recent events in South Africa?
Right. So I think first of all, I want to say perhaps that in the spirit of condemning, which Muzukulumwa Muswangali laid for us, in my case, I want to condemn those who think that because they have executive power, or those who think that they have been presidents or they have been freedom fighters, that therefore they are above the law, they are above the rulings of the judiciary, they are above the constitutional court, that those are the people who are perhaps the problem in my view. And so Botha is problematic. Indeed, he's problematic. However, he makes a statement about power, and a statement that for me is very telling. If you give these people power, and I associate myself with blackness, I'm a black woman, I am African in every sense of the word. I claim Africanness for myself. I have seen many people condemning the violent African, right? And I want to say that we should take a step first of all and really reflect on what the acting Chief Justice Sisi Kampepe, the woman who gave the ruling for Jacob Zuma and found him contemptuous. He was found in contempt of court after very many invitations to come to this commission and just defend himself. I think that the idea that a person thinks they are above the law simply because they have sat with executive power is a big statement and question, and maybe an indictment on our understandings of the nation state, on our understandings of democracy, on our understandings of what it means to be a member of a country. So while we are condemning, I think for me, my first point of rebuke, severe rebuke, is to the likes of Jacob Zuma and any other who may think that because of whatever powerful seat he has had, that therefore he suddenly is above the law. And I think that one of the statements that this woman, Justice Sisi Kampempe, made echoes or is echoed by what Muzukulu Muswangali said. And she says, no person is above the law, whatever his rank or condition. And that is the first thing to take home. I think the second one really is, if we're going to perform democracy and to perform the separation of power between the executive and the judiciary, that suddenly Zuma's defiance and those who want to support it, I have read the commentaries of many South Africans who have argued that, in fact, the Constitutional Court was wrong to have ordered him to go to direct imprisonment for 15 months, and they were saying he wasn't tried. And I'm thinking, some people, I saw in the initial stages of the riots, just after Zuma had handed himself over to power, I saw a number of Black South Africans standing on their feet, many men, and saying, we shall not allow the police to take Baba or to take Zuma. And the audacity to stand with a stick and a pair of balls, men en masse, performing a particular masculinity that says we are above the law. We shall protect him because he's a freedom fighter. And to forget the whole history of his failure to oblige, and if he's a freedom fighter, if he's a man who believes in constitutionalism, if he's a good president, if he's an exemplary father of the nation, he should lead us in obeying the Constitution. And so people who have tried to conflate the executive and the fight for freedom and lawlessness, again, are misusing and abusing access to power. And I think that part of the sadness for me is how powerless, hungry, poor, unemployed South Africans have. Initially, I didn't understand what was organizing. What is organizing all these people to come to the streets and make the threats? What is organizing them to respond and start looting? What is organizing the fire? What is organizing the arson? What is organizing the vandalism? And I think on one hand is a lot of powerlessness, just powerlessness and hunger and poverty and unemployment. And Zuma's imprisonment was a trigger for a hungry people during a COVID-19 crisis to take advantage of whatever it was. Do I condone and praise violence? No, I don't. But how do the masses speak to a system that has failed to cater for them and to include them? The vast majority of Black South Africans remain poor in spite of the independence of 1984. The vast majority of South Africans remain unemployed. They remain outside the new rainbow nation. And so without necessarily trying to justify or rationalize their violence, I think for me that hungry men, the Baganda say, Ejo Omusai, what do hungry people do to express in a language clear and audible their hunger, their ire, their anger, their poverty, their frustration? And I think that Zuma's imprisonment was a trigger for a lot of underlying past, amasida. There was a lot of past and sepsis and rot and pain within the lower cadre of South Africa. And this is just an opportunity for them to express what has been there. I think that the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that perhaps were supposed to have created some peace and healing, clearly failed. And I think South Africa was sitting on a time bomb. And back to Botha, well, we got power, but we didn't get power. Black people, Black South Africans still lack power in many ways.
Black people, Black South Africans still lack power in many ways. You mentioned a few things, including COVID-19, poverty, hunger, or hunger, whatever it is.
Both hunger and anger.
There you go. So, which I think are very important concepts to interrogate in this conversation, specifically in regards to what is happening in South Africa. And by the way, it was 1994, I believe, when that started, not 84. They have been in power for over 30 years, for almost 30 years now. Unlike the Ugandan experiment, where the so-called liberators have been in power for more than 35 years now, and similar things that you have mentioned that might have led to what the events in South Africa are also apparent or evident in Uganda's context. Many Ugandans impoverished, many youth in Uganda unemployed. Of course, there's a lot of apparent discrimination. There is also inequality, poverty, nepotism. And these are things that have been cited in academic literature by several sources explaining the experiment of democracy in Uganda. When we leave South Africa and get back to Uganda, are we on the right path to creating true democracy in Uganda, especially having helped the ANC achieve the so-called independence for both Black empowerment, African empowerment, but also for democracy as a desired concept to adopt. Mr. Wilobo, what are your thoughts on that? Is Uganda where it should be after 35 years of the NRA-NRM government?
Yes, thank you very much, Henry. In the previous submission, I would also like to add my voice. I think Stella gave the entire description and analysis that I wanted to provide. I wanted to add on to the fact that much as she mentioned the failures of Zuma, however, Zuma also inherited some of those failures. If we take back South African history itself in terms of where they came from post-apartheid itself, the handshake that Nelson Mandela had with Frederick de Klerk, that handshake, actually, we do not understand and know to date the actual discussions and the terms of reference to that took place. In other words, we could have seen much of the promises accomplished within the first few years that Nelson Mandela was inaugurated, but that did not take effect. Why? Because there must the so-called power, as Stella puts it, was not wholly provided to the Black South Africans. And if up to date there are those that call themselves from the Dutch colonies that came to South Africa, and they called themselves Afrikaans, and Afrikaans, they are owning everything and still having all the possessions, and they did not provide the education that was needed for the ordinary South African that could be a source of empowerment, that could have freed land so that an ordinary South African would own that, infrastructure-wise and all these other aspects. So all these other presidents that came after Zuma, the Thabo Mbeki, all those people had no power because there must be a focal point of reference to some of the agreements that was made post-apartheid. Now, coming back to the question you're asking me, much as we see that the problem of South Africa actually stems from right from 1948 itself, from when apartheid started to when it ended to date, some of those problems are socio-economic problems and to a smaller extent political. Why I say smaller extent political power can only if well harnessed and wholesomely provided, it can change a lot of situations. However, if it is less, it means that they do not have a voice to change policies, because ANC being in power for very many years, it has failed to create alternative or scrap the archaic, what I can say, the old policies that the apartheid regime had, which actually was a complete oppression of the indigenous people of South Africa. Now, when we compare the aspects of where Uganda is and where South Africa is, by the fact that ANC has not been able to change a lot of policies, a lot of situations of the ordinary people in South Africa, and much as some of the political infrastructure may be seen as working, but it is lacking in the ordinary person. It is not seen, it's not visible in the ordinary, which is the same as Uganda. Much as the Ministry of Finance and the government will come out to speak about the 3% growth in the economy of Uganda, but if you look at the ordinary person, the ordinary Uganda, you cannot see the economic growth. So the socio-economic growth is completely retarded completely. So they do not have the basics. Now, South Africa, of course, has the common things. The common things with Uganda is the persistent poverty, which of course stems from somewhere, where you have the white owning a lot of wealth, having a lot of wealth, owning almost the entire infrastructure. In fact, the BBC had a report about 20% of the wealth of South Africa is owned by only about 10 individuals. So you can imagine the kind of situation you would have if only 10 can own, only few individuals can own up to 20% of the entire country's wealth. And then you have the inequality, which of course speaks the same with Uganda, where you have the people in power taking out from the poor in terms of if somebody goes and buys out the poor people and the squatters have nowhere to go but to stay begging from these same people. Now, it may be different it may not be different also with regards to corruption. The same corruption that that Zuma is facing right now is the same thing that we are having. The only change and the only thing that we can see to date in South Africa is that at least their judiciary has shown some level of independence by at least biting. But in Uganda, there are so many corruption cases that have gone without even a mere indictment. And besides that, you look at a situation where the people do not have the ability to access health care, ability to have proper, efficient health care systems. For the past 30 years, yes, we have invested in infrastructure. We have infrastructure in terms of hospitals constructed, schools are built, but what is the content in the structures that we have? So when you look at also South Africa, I think there are certain situations that also caused like, for example, if you look at Becky, when he did the HIV ban on antiretroviral drugs, it was very, if it wasn't for the Western, the European countries to put pressure on that government, how many people would have died? So it gives you an understanding that the problems that South Africa is grappling with today are not different with what Uganda is having. But this all stems from the fact that if you have a persistently old regime in power, they do not have very many alternative policies that can enrich or empower their own people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Wilobo, for that submission. And I think you have also touched on a few things. Of course, you have taken us back. You have taken us back to the South African experiment, which I also want to go back to a little bit before I invite Mr. Mitala to give his analysis. In describing freedom and in describing his feelings about that so-called freedom when Nelson Mandela left the prison, when he was released from prison. In his book, Long Walk to Freedom, at some point he says that freedom without civility, freedom without the ability to live in peace, was not true freedom at all. I'm going back to the conversation that Stella alluded to, that even though blacks or South Africa has been somewhat free from apartheid for the last almost 3 decades, blacks or Africans really do not have that kind of power. They do not have power at all. As I said, Nelson Mandela, in describing the feelings he had about his release from prison, he said a few things, and I'm going to read you part of the one paragraph that he talks about, that he describes in Long Walk to Freedom, page 570. He says that today, my return to Soweto fills my heart with joy. At the same time, I also return with a deep sense of sadness. Sadness to learn that you are still suffering under an inhuman system. The housing shortage, the schools crisis, unemployment, and the crime rate still remain. As proud as I am to be part of the Soweto community, I have been greatly disturbed by the statistics of crime that I read in the newspapers. Although I understand the deprivations our people suffer, I must make it clear that the level of crime in the township is unhealthy and must be eliminated as a matter of urgency. Muzukulu wa Mswangalazi, you come in, sir. And of course, going back to what Mr. Wilobo has intimated in his submission, what are your thoughts on how leaders might have betrayed the people that they supposedly rescue in these in all these different liberations that they talk about?
That's a very, very, very relevant question that Henry that you posed here, and I think for me, I don't know whether any one of you has come across a term that is referred to as Zumani. It's made in reference to President Zuma's, failures as a politician, and especially in relation to the various allegations of corruption and graft that have been leveled against him that go back years, actually, before he even became president of South Africa. Some of the allegations that have been investigated and they are now being considered before court, they go back to the time when he was deputy president. You remember he was deputy president and he was sacked by Thabo Mbeki at the time because one of his key advisors had been involved in a very serious corruption scandal, which implicated President Zuma himself. And I think at that point, his credibility and ability to be a head of state, I think was quite, it was questioned at that point in time, that the man was too huge, he was too popular amongst the ordinary people. Given his background as a semi-illiterate, he seems to attract, the attention of the public to that degree. And I think he has played that card quite effectively to enable him to remain, relevant in South African politics. And this is not to reduce his contribution towards the struggle to liberate the African people during the apartheid era. But I think when you look at President Zuma, one of the things that come to your mind are things like, state capture, which we always refer to here as the deep state, the Putinist kind of situation where a clique of people, a small clique of people, they allocate themselves, all the state and its powers in essency, so that they kind of lock out everybody else in the decision-making process, and the actions and activities that they involve themselves in after that becomes very corruptible, and they become very dangerous to the existence of the state and nations. And this is exactly what we are seeing in South Africa. You have extreme exclusion, you have extreme poverty, you have there have been elements of police brutality, you know, the South African police acting brutally against its own people, you know, when sometimes it's really unnecessary to behave in such a manner, you know. Cronyism, you know, as again, you know, a small clique of people, tribesmen, you know, wives and sisters and brothers and children who come together and they control the state at the exclusion of everybody else. This is what Zuma became to signify, you know, in terms of South African politics as far as it's concerned. And I think what Zuma has done is that, and I think an issue has been raised that the kind of riots and demonstrations and looting that you've seen across South Africa, they were deliberate, they were organized by Zuma. There is a clip, Henry, I'll send it to you in the backyards. If you have the opportunity, you can be able to play it, you know, for the benefit of the audience who are watching us. Mr. Zuma was asked a question about the immunity of a head of state and other state, you know, operatives, you know, and he was very clear. He said, in his own words, he said there should never be a situation in South Africa where an individual can be bigger than the state. And I'm surprised that he's not been able to contemplate that and, you know, bring himself to humble himself before the state, so that, you know, he can be an example. I think the sorts of things that you see there, they're kind of very classic. And for me, the lesson I learned from here is that we are not very far from the Ugandan context. If you look at, you know, the corruption, the cronyism, the tribesmen, the tribalism, and all those sorts of things that are happening down there, scandals that are involving senior government officials, whereby the head of state is directly aware of those sorts of things, but is incapable of stepping in, you know, to eradicate those kind of corrupt practices. I think it's very, very worrying. So we have a Zumani situation there. We have a deep state capture, and all those things are very clearly, you know, they relate to our own situation. But then what do we take away from there? I think I would say that, you know, the gangsters who normally come to control government and state facilities, they possibly took advantage of the naivety of Mr. Zuma. You know, I think it's possible they took advantage of his naivety because, you know, I mean, anybody can read about the Gupita family, that family that most of them have now escaped South Africa. I think there have been attempts to extradite them and bring them back to South Africa to face court, and one of them is hiding in Saudi Arabia, you know, being protected by, you know, the rich and famous. But I think, as I hinted earlier, the key issue here is that we have to submit ourselves, you know, to institutions in order to let our democracies develop. If you look at our situation today, is there any individual in the judiciary who can pass, you know, a negative sentence against the head of state or his cronies? Most of things, when sorts of things have come, you know, have come to bear, you know, you've seen what has happened, to the extent that all those who are people who have been involved, who have been, you know, alleged to have been involved in this kind of, you know, corruption scandals, they are always protected, you know, by the state or by the head of state himself directly. So there are serious issues there. And I think really, until when that matter has been resolved, I think our people are always going to find themselves at this, you know, this kind of stale situation where we seem to be unable to resolve those kind of conflicts. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, for sure.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mitala. Dr. Stella, starting with Mitala's question, let's come back to the context of Uganda. If South Africa has a Zumani phenomenon happening, what does Uganda have? And what do you speak about or speak of the Ugandan judiciary? Could they pull off such a legal sentence?
Right. So I have experienced the judiciary in Uganda, and I did not stand before the judicial officers in any category other than a person who offended the president. So my two offenses where I have been a suspect standing in the dock have been around a complainant in the person of the president of Uganda. And one would expect me to think that, one would expect me to say that our judiciary in Uganda has failed entirely. But I want to say that while we experience state capture, I had the term state capture, which has mainly been an economic referent in South Africa. I think that in Uganda, there is extreme state capture of the judiciary to the extent that the Chief Justice is a crony of dictator Museveni, to the extent that very many courts and temples of justice have in fact become marketplaces where the highest bidder can pay for justice. And those of us who are poor and cannot afford corruption or a bribery or to pay their way out of a particular charge or to pay for their files disappearing, that those people are rotting in jail, and many of those tend to be political prisoners who are against the executive and the regime. I want to say, however, that I have experienced men with balls, women with spines, justice officers, judges and magistrates, a small remnant who still believe in constitutionalism and rule of law and have stood on their ground and defended the Constitution of Uganda and called out those who have corrupted the judicial system in our country. And so while to a large extent, the dictatorship has eaten its way into the temples of justice in our country, I want to say that there are still a few strong cadres fighting for the rule of law and the independence and autonomy of the judiciary in Uganda. And I can give some names if the need arises. I think perhaps what is instructive is that even after the acting Chief Justice gave that monumental judgment and had Zuma present himself to prison, she stepped down. She's resigning. And so there is a cost. There's a heavy cost that one pays. She was criticized a lot, particularly by Black South Africans, for being a sellout and a betrayer. And so there's a heavy cost that individuals who step out pay for standing for the Constitution and truth and rule of law. I want to kind of touch on a question which you asked Wilobo, and I think he addressed the economic aspect. And I want to say that perhaps in terms of comparing the ANC and the NRM in Uganda, that for me, I see a change in the leadership from Nelson Mandela, Madiba, to Thabo Mbeki, to Jacob Zuma, to Cyril Ramaphosa. And like the NRM, where for 35 years we have had one man, one man at the forefront, the center, the back, the left, the right of every decision-making opportunity in the NRM. And I think that part of our conundrum as Ugandans, part of our leadership crisis stems from that difference, where the ANC has had a succession plan and where the ANC has shown a number of capable leaders. Of course, it's a pity that they're all men, as if women cannot be presidents of South Africa, presidents in the ANC, yet there's a powerful women's league. It is interesting for me, and it is commendable that in spite of all the failings of South Africa and the African National Congress, we see a handing down of power from one leader to another, to another, to another. We don't see the same sort of mentorship and grooming of leaders, the same sort of handing the baton to the next relay runner happening in the NRM, and that is part of the reason why the dictator has grown so large. The executive power he holds is so big that he can even think he can supersede and override the judiciary. That's the second point I wanted to make. I think in relation to the Guptas, which is a point that the other panelists mentioned, Muzukulu wa Muswangali mentioned the three Gupta brothers, Atul, Ajay, and Rajesh, that for me, in comparing South Africa and Uganda, that it is scary, the similarities, where Jacob Zuma allowed the Gupta brothers to actually influence government policy to the extent that they were deciding hiring and firing of ministers, and they chose those who aligned with their family business interests. And so in Uganda, we have nepotism, where it is Yoweri Museveni and his wife Janet and their son Muhoozi and his brother Saleh and their cousin Diana Twine and their niece and their nephew and their cronies and Kutesa and we see this family dynasty and just immense shameless selection of family members to head all the institutions of state. Whether or not they have qualifications is never a question, and it's happening with shamelessly, it's with so much impunity and not questioning. And I think that part of the exciting lesson that one can draw from South Africa right now is that there will be a day of reckoning. Every thief has 40 days, and one of the signals I hoped would be coming from the penalization of Jacob Zuma was that Yoweri Museveni and his cronies would be learning that one day he will be out of power, and although he may have presidential immunity today, one day, just like the Gupta brothers fled from the country when Jacob Zuma lost power, perhaps the very same scenario will happen in our country, and there will be a day of reckoning. And who knew that Jacob Zuma, you know, I as a feminist, I have to give this little example, the example of the woman he raped. I don't know if you remember, but Jacob Zuma raped a young woman who visited his home, and when he was tried in court, he claims she was wearing a kanga, okay? And so she's responsible for seducing him. And when he was asked about protection and HIV, because it was at the peak of the HIV crisis in South Africa, he said he washed, and therefore because he washed, he was free of HIV transmission. The point about having a low education, which I think it was Muzukulu wa Muswangali raised, is important. Coming from Zuma's lack of education, what is Yoweri Museveni, who's slightly educated, learning from a misogynist, a man who abuses and rapes women and gets away? The law never got him. He got away with that specific case. He got away with all the different invitations to stand and defend his corruption allegations. And I think for me, the shocker, the really last point I'll say is the shocker for me, and I think that the lawyer on the team can come. The shocker for me is that Jacob Zuma does not go into prison because of corruption or raping women or stealing or nepotism or. He is very smartly, his legal team is amazing. He goes in for contempt of court, a very minor charge in my opinion. And not any of the other incriminating charges. And so Yoweri Museveni, there are very many charges we are noting down, we shall level against him. He better learn from Jacob Zuma, which of the least likely injurious charges he will say yes to, he will answer to, because we are taking him to court one day. And hopefully there'll be no Ugandans rioting on his behalf. Maybe we shall be going to the streets to dance when he goes to Luzira and wears that yellow uniform that many of us have worn unjustly.
The yellow
I think Henry, before you
come in, Mr. Mswangari, the yellow uniform has been lately the yellow uniform seems to signify some kind of heroism. And as Mandela once said, that first you go to prison, then you become president. I'm not sure if Mr. Museveni or President Museveni was once a prisoner. I've heard that, of course, there were some interactions with the law when he was Minister of Defense at some point. But in regards to talking about the idea of keeping the law, keeping in line with the law, I think this is very important, and I want us to interrogate how leaders interact with their audiences in regards to the law before it comes to their doorstep. And I want you to look at this clip by Jacob Zuma, and then Mr. Mswangari, you can respond in 1 minute before Mr. Wilobo comes in to respond.
Of immunity?
No, why should I do so? We are running a constitutional democracy in South Africa, and you are practicing a very clear rule of law. There is no president, whether he wins with 2/3 majority, who can then stand up there and say, I'm now cancelling these charges. Impossible in the South African setting. What we are doing in South Africa, which people should appreciate, is that we are treating our constitutional democracy so well that no citizen of this country can be said because he or she holds certain positions cannot be tried. That's what, in fact, we are going to see. We are going to once again do something that is unprecedented in this country, wherein the president will go to court and answer questions and test the allegations against him and allow the court of law to determine whether he was guilty or not guilty. Shouldn't we be saying, once again, the democratic South Africa is showing the world what you need to do? That you don't, because you hold certain positions, then be above the law. Everybody is equal before the law. This is what I think the world should be saying. What an interesting processes that are taking place in South Africa.
Well, that is indeed very
adopted TikTok clip or conversation.
absolutely smashing, and I think that's what I wanted, the audience to see, because that is Jacob Zuma before things became hot on his legs, and he found himself, running away from the very processes that he was so he admired so much. So one wonders then, what has happened between now and then that he doesn't feel comfortable any longer, to put that demonstration to the test until its until its conclusion. But just very briefly, I think I just wanted to provide some further information on the issue that Stella raised about Jacob Zuma, raping that young woman. I think what was so horrendous in that particular situation is that this young girl had been raised by Zuma. The girl grew up in his house, so she was calling him father, to an extent. And you can imagine a father of the house, putting his pants off and laying himself bare before a kid who calls himself, who calls him father, and then that man years later goes on to become president of the country, and nobody raises questions, because these were things that were, properly, adjudicated in court, and it was horrendous to hear those evidences. So this is what I said. That I think Mr. Zuma the gangsters have played on his naivety to a certain degree. That doesn't take away, the blame from him. And as he himself, he says there, nobody should really be, above the state. We are all equal before the eyes of the law. On the question of, the various charges that have been levied against him and the fact that he's only being done for contempt of court, I think what Jacob Zuma attempted to do was really to frustrate the process of court altogether, because he was set in this belief that Stella has already raised it as a freedom fighter, his stature as a former president and so on, and his age. And of course, he's aligned up, very serious loyalists behind him, across all different networks. And he really believed that he could be able to frustrate the court and he would get away with it. So the seriousness of the charge that has put him to where he is, if you go to court and you are given a 15-month sentence, kind of a 15-month jail sentence, that is a very serious crime. It cannot be taken lightly, because that means that even if he was to come back, maybe to run for another office, as he might possibly likely to do, that charge will hold against him, except if it's been, appealed and appealed successfully. So I think, for me, I'm proud of the South African judicial system. I'm proud of what they are doing. And one of the other things that has been very interesting is that it's been said, I picked up one of a story that suggested that in a meeting previously, arranged between the security officials and police and the army, the South African army initially refused to engage with the public because they thought that was not a domain for them to go into. It's the job of the police to police those kind of issues. The army has got no role. The only reason the army has now got involved is because it has become quite very clear that there's a grand scheme of things that is, actually people were saying that Mr. Zuma in the backyard, he was trying to organize a coup d'etat against the South African government. So those are some of the things that have been raised. I don't know how credible they are, but they are flies on the wall. But I think the grand issue is that, and I think this is what we've already said here, institutions are very important in any development of any country. When institutions have been washed down and watered down and made irrelevant by an individual, what you are left with is a mess. And I hope that in the end, institutions will prevail.
Mr. Wilobo, you're opposed to all those. I know there's a lot that has happened between and the clips. Your thoughts on that, Mr. Wilobo?
Well, I appreciate you have a very serious interaction. Actually, Mr. Muswangali today, I think I've got that right? Musukwa Muswangali, I think you provide, I think you lived, I don't know whether you lived in South Africa at one point.
I've not lived in South Africa.
But the thing is that whatever that clip that you've just shown, it speaks certain things that Jacob Zuma is making an opaque kind of appearance for us, for the public and for the South Africans. And before my submission, I want to correct the statistics that I gave, that the 10 people, it is actually 20% of South Africans own 70% of the entire resources of South Africa. Going to the democracy that Zuma is alluding to be following, it has captured him in the middle, but also we do not see the inside of it, because behind the curtains we have a lot of invisible influences, and whatever that he has done, he shouldn't have gone away with it, and whatever that happened, he must pay for whatever that he did, because 35 million US dollars is a lot of money to just loot just like that from the coffers of the government. But most importantly, what would democracy state? Because whatever that he's trying to create is that no one is above the law. But whatever that he was doing behind the curtains was actually trying to insinuate that he's above the law, and trying to make delays of the court process and contempts of court and all these other antics were all geared towards proving a point that he's above the law. Now, but the democracy that he talks about, as you mentioned, Henry, here, democracy, we can use a lot of factors to measure democracy in a given country. For our case, our experiment of Uganda, for instance, if we look at the political, the Freedom House, let's use the Freedom House for a moment. If you use the Freedom Index to measure democracy in most of the African countries, there are very, very few that can pass. Because, for instance, in Uganda, you have so many political leaders that are already banned or have been banned, and there are so many sanctions against Uganda as a country and also individuals in the government for breaches of human rights and trying to create injustices in the population. And Stella here is one of the live examples of the victims of injustices that happen. So we cannot create a situation where we are looking at South Africa or Uganda, for that matter, as free, because I think there are only 11 countries that pass that mark of freedom in Africa, in the entire Horn of Africa. So if we are to go back to the statements that Jacob Zuma makes in terms of being able to, of course, honor the judgments and honor whatever outcomes, and he's trying to make all those statements of being following the constitutional democracy and the constitutional law, it would not also be appropriate for him to have the economic inequality as we see today, because you have the poor very poor and the wealthy, the rich more richer, to the extent that the poor now becomes angry. They are hungry and angry, and when somebody is hungry, always they can do anything to make sure that they eat. And whatever that we see in terms of economic index of measuring democracy, still South Africa fails, and Jacob Zuma's regime also still failed terribly. Much as I do not want to blame him wholesomely for some of the economic inequalities of South Africa, he had the power, and through his party, ANC, to be able to correct and alter the kind of policies that were passed, that were post-apartheid. He had the opportunity to do so and to change and to empower the South Africans into better citizens in terms of economy. And the poverty that we see today, we wouldn't be seeing people running around eating bread, just looking for bread in the supermarkets, because the breakdown right now of South Africa is not because they even have the political motive, because they are trying to show that, okay, they have indicted this person wrongly, or they have jailed this Jacob Zuma wrongly, but it speaks into how Jacob Zuma would make us believe that he is following constitutional democracy by coming out to make a statement that I am guilty, or I would go and if of course pronounced by court, I would follow what the Constitution says to make sure that they investigate, execute, and the sentence is served. accordingly and amicably, and there wouldn't be any problem. But where we have what would be imagined as a political protest becoming a riot into looting, that is now far-fetched. It is far from the democracy we are supposed to look out for, because you see, South Africa has become like the masterpiece and the center of protests in the world, where there is no country in the world that has paraded the most number of riots or protests like South Africa. But all this stems from the fact that there is a breakdown in the constitutional democracy that Jacob Zuma is trying to speak in that video. And also, when we interrogate the fact that all the civil unrest and all the xenophobic tendencies and all the unemployment and all these other things, socioeconomic problems of South Africa, is simply because there is a breakdown in both a breakdown in the democratic rule of South Africa. If only there was that equality, if there was employment, if there was all these other things, we wouldn't be seeing whatever we are seeing today. And with that regard, I feel like most politicians and most leaders woodwink the population into believing things that they preach what they do not do, and they actually act in the opposite of what the population or the citizens expect them to do. Because when you consider the handshake that I talked about in my submission about South Africa itself, that handshake, we see it in Kenya also, where you've seen the person that was at the forefront of the struggle having a handshake, and before we know it, we have the Raila Odinga taking center stage and sharing power with the person that he was criticizing all this while for breaching constitutional democracy. So we have so much as Africa to learn from, but because we are not able to actually contextualize the whole, or maybe we do not have the capacity to solve our own problems, because the only thing that we know is to come into power, hold power, but also the people, branding the people and branding the individual leaders makes it very difficult to trust the power of the government with the individuals that we bring as the savers, as the Jesus of democracy, whereby they are power hungry. The moment they get their hands into power, they want to cling on to it. You are muted, Mr. Sali.
And with that, I want to ask Dr. Stella a question. Do leaders in Africa hoodwink their populace? Of course, as you can reference President Museveni's inaugural speech as president of the Republic of Uganda, he said that the problem of Africa is leaders who overstay in power. 35 years later, we do have a President Museveni presiding over the Republic of Uganda. What lessons can he learn from Mr. Zuma's submission earlier?
Right. So I think for me as a government critique, I think that we should recognize political rhetoric for what it is. And for those of us who criticize those with executive power simply to show the world that they are liars, we must take advantage of every inconsistency within political rhetoric, even when we know that, for example, campaign promises are often just a performance of lies, right? A collection, a compendium of untruths. which are sold as one's manifesto. And so do they perform? Of course they perform. Can Museveni learn from Zuma? There's a lot to learn, but he will not learn. And I think for me that the biggest lesson, based on what we have seen, that Museveni must learn, that Ugandans must learn, is that our freedom fighters of yesterday can become the worst despots, can forget who we are, and can sell us out, that our greatest liberators, such as the Zumas and the Musevenis and the Mugabes of this world, we must watch every step they take, and we must keep reminding them of every word they have spoken, if not to get them to own up, at least to show them for the liars they are. And for me, I think it's part of my political program now is to highlight the untruths that have been spoken. And I think for me, one that I did was the sanitary pad campaign, where Museveni said he'd give sanitary pads to all girls after he was sworn into power in 2017, or was it 2016? He reneged, he went against. He reneged against his promise. And people say to me, Stella Nyanzi, you're foolish to think that when the president promised sanitary pads to girls, he meant what you were saying. And I was saying, well, he promised so many other things. It's like the food during COVID-19. They promised to give us food and radios for our children to study. And Nabanja promised 100,000. That was the last promise, etc., and vaccines and PPP. And he's not going to stand again for presidency, yet 2031 or 2026 he might be standing again. And so I think our duty as critics, as government analysts, as political commentators, is to keep highlighting the inconsistencies and contradictions between what they say and what they do. And I think that the TikTok video where Zuma is saying, no president can be above the law, they will all be brought to court, they must come to court and speak, is he himself indicting himself. I think I've answered your question. I think I just wanted to say that for me, we must watch very carefully presidents who stay in power for long, and regimes that hold in power, that stay in power for very long, because we can use their very words against them to highlight their failings and their excesses.
Right.
And Henry, I was going to say that I think for me that one of the spaces where I think we do it best is what Muzukulu wa Muswangali did. He brought a TikTok video that the internet has freed up so much space for us, where we can exercise our digital freedoms and our freedom to express ourselves in whatever ways, criticizing these people. And while we might not have space to go and protest peacefully in the streets because there'll be military and police combined, we can do a lot of organizing online.
Right. Mr. Muswangali, Muzukulu wa Muswangali. Stella Mitala, Muzukulu wa Muswangali. Your response to that?
What lessons can be learned? I think for me the issue of lack of opportunity for people is very crucial. I mean, if you look at South Africa and compare it to our people, lots of young people unemployed, the age is between 18, 24, even up to 45. You have people who are really, desperate for the sake of being desperate. And I think our situation is not very different from the sorts of things that you are seeing from South Africa. Obviously, the South African situation might be more complicated than our situation because they went through, years, decades of oppression without anything at all to go to look up for. And they had a lot of hope in people like Jacob Zuma and so many leaders who came before, hoping that they would be able to liberate them from, the abject poverty. But that doesn't seem to have worked. Instead, people are still clamoring on, and they are clamoring on to the hope that the revolution would produce something tangible for them at an individual level to be able to escape, the abject poverty. And that's not very different from what you are seeing in our people. Lots of Ugandans are really desperate, And I think, as George referenced here, we are being told that the economy is growing, and the figures are given to us that, the economy is growing at 5%, 4%, or whatever, 4%. But if you ask an ordinary Ugandan whether, that growth is actually felt in their own pockets, you would have a very different response. And I think those are very toxic kind of things that really pit people, against the state. And I would hope that, some kind of effort, serious effort would be taken by those who are in charge of the government to make sure that nobody is left behind. And that means creating opportunity, treating people equally and fairly. The state is entitled to act in certain ways. Like in the case of South Africa today, the president is being very clear. He thinks that, what is happening in there, what is unfolding before them is a deliberate attempt by Mr. Zuma's cronies, even though he's not naming Mr. Zuma directly, but he's saying that, this was a very deliberate attempt that has been properly planned, pre-planned. And I think one of the other issues that has been brought forward is that, a certain tribe, the Zulu people, whom Mr. Zuma came to rely on so much through his presidency, his kinsmen are worried of losing power, the actual prospect of losing power and all the connections that power can provide. And therefore they went onto a secret attempt to make sure that they frustrate all these processes so that Mr. Zuma can remain to stand. And I think that is something that needs to be avoided. But the issue of making sure that we create a space where nobody is left behind, that's really crucial. And being left behind means being left behind economically, to empower people economically, to allow people the opportunity to be able to look for opportunities for themselves without being heavily subdued by the state, as we come to see in many of our situations. For me, those are really the key issues. If they were the takeaway, they're the source of things that I would really want us to take away from the South African situation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mitala Mzwangali. George, Mr. Wilobo, as we conclude this conversation, should Ugandans or Africans in general, should Ugandans in particular be conscious of opposition leaders who are promising us heaven on earth?
Most definitely. Today we live in a world where there are so many forces that that influence certain things, because you would not expect someone to just come from anywhere. However, most of the times, I presented this somewhere also, that public offices or public leadership is more to do with first the self-interest first. The second would be, of course, the public interest. Much as we can pretend and say, okay, I come and as to give myself in the struggle because I want to liberate Ugandans. As a political leader, that would be the word of mouth to the population, and the population have to take that word as though you are sacrificing. But at the back of that leader's mind, there is some highest degree of self-interest. Now, in between the self-interest of the leader, there is also invisible forces or invisible influences that also have interest in the interest of the leader. Now, that creates a very unique balance of service, because you have someone that comes. You have noticed with most of the MPs that we bring to Parliament, some of them, of course, are funded to get into Parliament. The funding comes from somewhere, because that person also is expecting a return or a reverse of service or a reverse of action. Now, you cannot expect to serve 2-3 masters at the same time. One has to take the center stage, and that's why most Ugandans, the time they see their leaders is when there is an election. And when that happens, they are promised and given handouts. And because Ugandans are poor, when they are given little handouts, they sell their votes to these leaders. And they do not come back to even check on them. We see it in the policies that this government passed. There is a crisis in the government, in the population in the country, but you have a parliament discussing an extremely irrelevant aspect of their passing policies or laws that are not even relevant to the pertinent issues that are facing the population. Now, when you see all that happening, it shows it's a symptomatic kind of gesture that the people that we bring to power are not actually pro-people that we expect. With the exceptions of the few, of course, the selfless people that we have, the majority of the people right now, for example, in the current regime, they came to power knowing that this is our last chance to eat. And they have made it look so cheap to that level, whereby somebody comes and injects his millions, invests. It's an investment now. They invest to become a member of parliament. In return, they expect, of course, to reap the fruits of the harvest. So, in other words, the sole purpose of leaders have been eroded with the current society we have. And when you look at whatever riots that may come out of bad leadership and all, they are just symptomatic kind of things that shows you how the institutions are broken down, how angry people are, how desperate the people are. And you may not believe, but the biggest challenge of South Africa is also the privatization that we talked about last time, where you have individuals that Mr. Mitala mentioned, the Gupta brothers, where they have stake in the government directly because of the wealth that they have created, because of the private properties that they have purchased from the government through privatization policies, and taking out the government ability to be able to provide for her citizens, and replacing it with the profit-oriented individuals and businesses. Now, the same applies to Ugandan case, where you have individuals in government instead are investing in the private sector, and they inflate and influence government purchases, government procurement to benefit themselves, and you have an entire sector that is owned. You may think that they are owned by private individuals, but inside these private individuals, you also have the leaders that are supposedly working for the people. So you cannot expect any match. That's why, for me, we cannot stand, or you cannot even for a second believe in some of the leaders that we elect into power.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wilobo, for that submission. Of course, we are going to transition into examining the Ugandan government's stern warning to bloggers. Of course, you know what has happened in the previous couple of days. Similar to what happened to Dr. Stella Nyanzi when he was arraigned into court. For those bloggers who the government cannot directly get hold of, there has been a stern warning against them, and I want us to explore some of to interrogate some of the things, statements that were made. Of course, we shall also try to make sense of the attacks against Chief Justice or Chief Magistrate Gladys Kamasanyu. But before we do that,
this is the state of the nation. Irifa Mwanga. We are deliberate, we are reasonable, we are uncensored. The State of the Nation with Henry SSALI.
I want to thank each and every one of you who is joining us online. I want to encourage you to share these conversations. If you're on Facebook, please share them and tag all the people who you think might benefit in listening to these conversations. If you haven't already, please go on YouTube and try to follow, subscribe, follow that channel so that you can be listening to these conversations whenever they happen. Of course, they happen every Sunday, 6 p.m. Kampala time. So I'm going to, with that said, we really appreciate your support in following these conversations, and we encourage you to continue reaching out to us. If you would like to be a participant in these conversations, please don't hesitate to message either one of the regular panelists on this channel, so that we can listen to what you have to say and learn from you as you learn from us. Also, perhaps unlearn some of the few things that we may be taking for granted. With that said, I'm going to invite Dr. Stella to start this conversation, as, of course, has been said. Let us make sense of the bloggers. Well, when you're in Kampala, it was easier for the government to pick you up at an event where I had gone. You were thrown into a small car that had no numbers, or numberless car, and you were taken around places that you didn't know. Of course, there are some bloggers which the government cannot readily get hold of. People like most of the bloggers, I'm not going to mention names, but there has been a stern warning against them. Please, we do have about 15 minutes before the end of the conversation. Touch base on that, and also your thoughts about the recent attacks against the Chief Magistrate. Dr. Stella.
Right, so I believe in digital rights, in freedom of expression, in internet freedom. I totally believe that we are in an age where, especially in Uganda, where the repressive government has shut up a number of us, and people are scared of speaking and criticizing Yoweri Museveni and his dictatorship for the excesses of their regime. And so many of the people who are speaking on behalf of Uganda and doing the work of expressing dissent and criticizing a militant dictator are people who are based outside the country, and we cannot thank them enough for the sort of work they're doing. I want to say outright that for me, I believe in total freedom of expression, with the exception perhaps of inciting violence through hate speech, especially if this is targeted at minorities, be it because of race or gender or sexual orientation or nationality. I think that hate speech we must guard against. And I also think that there are areas around terrorism and spreading propaganda for war, child pornography, a few limitations where we must protect minors and protect ourselves as individuals. But when it comes to public figures such as Yoweri Museveni, especially public figures who excessively use power, including military power, to kill, to abduct, to disappear, to detain without trial or charge, that in that case we must speak freely and we must protect particularly what we call political speech that is critical of these excesses of power. So the issue around the announcement of Yoweri Museveni and the announcement of his death was very exciting for me. I'm one of the people who celebrate any news that comes that speaks towards the misfortune of misrulers in Uganda. I am not repentant in saying that I will dance the day we hear that Yoweri Museveni is dead. Okay, I have said it many times. And so when others produce obituaries or they eulogize him, I join in that sort of public speech, not because I'm a witch. We have been called witches. That we have been told it is un-African to celebrate the death and the demise of a person in power, but that is the only last beacon of resistance we have, and we shall use it. And so I think it is ridiculous and quite silly of the government to warn people in other jurisdictions. The case where I was convicted and sentenced to 18 months, we won on a jurisdictional question that the court which tried and convicted me had no jurisdiction over me. There was the geography of where I was would not allow the court, Buganda Road Court, presided over by Kamasanyu Gladys, who you've invited us to talk about her current beating. She had no jurisdiction to charge, try, prosecute, convict, and sentence me. And by the time the higher court made this decision, it was already 15 months into my court sentence, right? And so, you know, Henry, or is he Fred Rumbuye, Peng, and everybody else who is criticizing Yoweri Museveni from outside the country, please keep doing the work you do. I think I want to give caution around misinformation, disinformation, lying, libel and slander were taken off our books in Uganda. But then if we are going to criticize the regime, I would rather that we based on fact, on truth. And while I believe in exaggeration as a technique and a tactic of communicating, especially one of the weapons that we, the weak or the powerless, can use, I also think it's important that we are credible sources of information, because those who prophesied the death of Yoweri Museveni did some powerful work around allowing us to celebrate the moment and express our disgust of his continued life and his presidency. But then they also took away from us, because 2 days later, Yoweri Museveni showed up in a suit standing beside Janet, and I nearly cried with disappointment. So that, I think I've said what I must say. Threatening extradition or bringing these people back to Uganda, threatening to disown them, all those are threats of a dying horse. Like, let's keep saying what we have to say. I think there may be repercussions when we show up at the airport. There may be a few repercussions, but they cannot arrest 1,000 of us. And I think the invitation for me is that we have many more cadres joining the cause, because they can't be arresting everybody who gets off the airplane at Entebbe airport and taking us to Kamasanyu's court. Very quickly on Kamasanyu, it is unfortunate that a mother, a woman, a Ugandan professional was beaten up by assassins on a motorbike. It is terrible. I celebrate her beating because, again, I'm an honest Ugandan who was tried unfairly, trumped up charges. We challenged the charges that were brought against me. She prosecuted me. She tried me in so many ways that violated my right to a fair hearing. My High Court ruling, which has 23 areas in which my human rights as a prisoner were abused by by Magistrate Her Worship Gladys Kamasanyu, is on the record. And so for me, I think that a professional, a beautiful Christian woman who is out to fulfill the will and the fantasy of an oppressive, militant, unjust dictator, when she meets a sad event like the one she met outside a school, going to get the results of her child, the natural response for me would be to feel so sad. Unfortunately, I'm not sad at all. I celebrate, and I think it's a good lesson to her. I think that it is within my rights to celebrate the demise, the misfortune of my enemy. I consider her an enemy of the people because there's so many Ugandans whom she has tried unfairly, and I am not the only one. There were very many men standing in the cells downstairs at Uganda Road Court, just waiting. And when I talk about people who are able, Natalie Farida, thank you for the love. I see it. But I was talking about these men who had no money and were pleading with court orderlies to take them and get an appointment to see Chief Justice, not Chief Justice,
Chief Magistrate.
Magistrate Gladys Kamasanyu. Poor women who are accused wrongly of trafficking animals and wildlife, and there was no mercy. There was no mercy for the poor. And so I think that for me, a person who's doing their profession must be respected. But clearly, I am very conflicted because professionals who are using their privilege, their skills, their expertise to serve a dictator, it serves them right, it serves them right, it serves them right. I hope that she takes a lesson and she changes. She says she's a Christian. May God forgive all of us, but we are praising God because vengeance belongs to him. And this is scripture. He has avenged us, and we thank him for this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stella. We do have a legal mind on the panel, so I'm going to invite him to share his thoughts, both in regard to how the Ugandan government envisions implementing their policies against bloggers, but also in regard to what happened to Chief Magistrate Gladys, especially given the fact that there was a justice that was assassinated, Justice Kagezi. What should we think of these acts? Also putting in consideration that there are so many assassinations that have not been resolved to date. You can say that in 4 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes.
Yes, Henry. I think number one, I should say that I think this is a propaganda. I think the government realizes that they have lost the propaganda war, and therefore they are trying all things within their reach to see how they can be able to curtail, the amount of work that is being done by online bloggers, both internally and externally. I think it's bound to fail, in my assessment, for a number of reasons. Because, and of course, as Stella has said, there's a distinction between deliberate misinformation and people carrying out combing for terrorism kind of activities on the internet, issues around child protection, whatever this is, there's this new modern element of modern slavery, and so there are some gruesome kind of crimes that can be organized on crime, and I think the government is entitled absolutely to police that area and make sure they are keeping people online absolutely safe. But I think the domain that we are heading into is both laughable and it's undesirable and it's unnecessary, absolutely speaking. I think there are a few countries in the world. I'll give an example here: Russia and the Philippines. They have used this kind of oppressive kind of measures to try to silence down social media because they deem that area to be the place where it's becoming very difficult for them to be able to spread their propaganda. And I think one of the interesting elements of all this conversation is that normally when people talk about regulating social media and regulating speech, they are always thinking about regulating speech for the other person, but not for themselves. Because, the sorts of things that are happening that are undesirable on the internet, they are just not one-sided. They are also coming from the other side. There's a lot of, false information that is, spread by people who speak on behalf of the government. There are also people who blog on behalf of the government who are very, uncouth in their language. They insult other people. They use very unbecoming language on social media and so on and so forth. But they do seem to get away with that. And some of those are actually presidential advisors or so-called presidential advisors. I don't know exactly how true it is that they are presidential advisors, but we've seen some of those people, and they are using very, very aggressive and very, language that you could never contemplate using in passing through your own mouth, Henry. So, but those are things. But I think for me, I think those ventures are bound to fail. Number one is that the area of extradition is actually very, very complex kind of area, and I wonder whether in some of the countries where those people are based, the government has got agreements, with those specific countries to be able to even think about attempting to extradite them, back home to be able to charge them with whatever offenses that they are thinking of charging them with. The other interesting issue is this issue about stripping people of their citizenship, because I saw one of the things that I was said was to strip people of their citizenship. I think under international law, you cannot strip somebody of their citizenship. You cannot make somebody stateless. I think people need to speak from an informed point of view to understand what international law says, some of the things that can be done, and some things that cannot be practically done. So I think for me, maybe the government needs to engage with these people in a different format than going down the area of issuing threats right back and center, because that's bound. It's going to be counterproductive, and it's not going to yield anything productive from that. On the thrashing up of the magistrate, I really don't know what to say about that. I think it goes to show that nobody is safe. That's all I could say, because if magistrates are getting attacked, if prominent soldiers are getting attacked, everybody is getting attacked, then the question that comes to my mind is that what is the state of the security of the state of security of an ordinary person in the country? If such important people who are supposed to be privileged, they are well protected, they don't move around like randomly or aimlessly in a manner that is disorderly. What is the state of security of an ordinary person if people of such a caliber also suffer the humiliations, the common humiliations of a day-to-day man? Somebody who is walking down the street and you are clobbered because you are holding a nice handset of a phone in your hand, or because somebody wants your wallet or your bag. These have been very common things. We used to be told that these were done by yobs and people who are criminals in town. But it looks like the security system is practically not able to deal with these sorts of things, and they are spreading on to other very important persons. My worry is that we are pitting these people in a space that is going to make them very paranoid, and by becoming paranoid, they are bound to make very, very dangerous decisions, because they are making decisions that are not rational, but they are making decisions because they are emotional, because they will look at everybody as an enemy, and therefore when you appear before somebody, they ban you as an enemy, and the decisions that they are bound to be made are bound to be irrational decisions. So those would be my worries about those sorts of things. But I really don't know what to say about her beating. I hope she's well, and I hope she survives and she comes out, in a better state.
Thank you so much, Muzukulwa Muswangali. George.
Yes.
As you wrap up, your responses to both.
Well, Henry, most of the times we see you see, China was able to successfully contain the social media boom because they have the capacity and the technology to do so. In our case, we only have a handicapped ministry of ICT and UCC and these other ministries that have incompetent persons that are even manning them for that matter. It would be a very easy thing to do for a country like Uganda that has if it had a fully functional ICT and UCC that regulates communications in the entire country, to have or to put in place competent young people that can be able to counteract misinformation that comes out from some of the sources rapidly and quickly to be able to inform the public very clearly. However, let's go back to the social media evolution, because during the time of the Besiges, 2001, from that time, we had the chimezas, where people would criticize government with very serious content, with very serious factual information, with very serious points of references. However, what has happened with the social media boom, and you see the ICT and the internet and information technology is one of the fastest growing. It is soon becoming an industry itself. So it is going to be very difficult, of course, to regulate them, but it has brought two main things into the limelight. There is content and the numbers. Now, because I want the numbers, it brought in the aspect of misinformation, lies, propaganda, but there is also facts. Now, the content creators or the content providers of some of these media platforms have triggers and have specific ways that they provide information, and as you may bear witness that misinformation or lies spread better than facts. And if you want to prove this information that we are talking about right now is based on actually very informed people like Dr. Stella Nyanzi, my brother Mitala. But look at the kind of view that we may be having right now in this social media platform we are on right now. So our society has been infiltrated with misinformation, and misinformation is consumed more heavily and very quickly than factual information. Now it creates a discrepancy in terms of creating a mechanism in regulating them, because the society chooses what they want to consume. Me, if I have my data, I choose to watch this show or go to the next that will be making misinformation or lies to me directly. However, when we trickle down to look at what are the baselines of this misinformation and the lies and all this, majorly it will be lies. I mean, it will be numbers, trying to command numbers onto the social media platforms and viewership. But there is also an underlying factor that most of our leaders are creating a blind eye on. Because when you threaten misinformation with aggressive attacks, it only breeds new misinformation centers. Because the threats also will be misunderstood, and it will create. But instead, if the government was smart enough, with the guidance of with the guidance of the ICT, and if they were even functional for that matter, they would make sure that they have counter information to the misinformation, so that the person consuming the misinformation can doubt the integrity of the source. So if I am, for example, I'm a blogger and I've brought in misinformation, I will have to tag the misinformation, give it a fake news cross and tag, and provide the rightful information so that the consumers can take it. However, if that is all said and done, whatever that we say or speak about in this open social media that is less regulated, we must also be able to have a level of responsibility in what we say, and have own responsibility to them at the same time. So for that matter, it is because of the current political atmosphere that has completely changed, where everybody has come in, including the people that I call the political adolescents, who may not have any political understanding of the regime, of what takes place, but because they have sources that they get information, and then they make a blend of salt and water and then some sugar, and then they make it spike. However, when you asked me the best alternative that the government would come out to create some of these things, this social media is a very useful platform to be able to have employment on. And if used appropriately, and if created to, if made to create jobs for the young people, it can be a very big boom for the government in terms of employment. I will comment on the Chief Magistrate's lashing. These are acts of symptomatic situations that Ugandans are facing. Yes, it might be any ordinary criminals, but even the criminals are also the mastermind behind the criminalities is actually the inequality, the injustices, unemployment, poverty, and all these other aspects that affect the socioeconomic empowerment or development of an ordinary Ugandan. Now, the time is coming when some of these people who have accumulated wealth, the poor will be looking at them as a source that they can also get from. And that's why we have so many situations where criminals have been bred within the society, and they have target persons and target groups. And because we are living in a society that is mixed and mingled, even the poor becomes affected in the same system. But if there was no some of these injustices, the unemployment rates, nobody would be going for somebody's purse. Nobody would be going for somebody's property. But we must be able to build a system. The government has to be able to either change or recall some of their policies that they have for the people.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Wilobo. And
I think Henry, just before you close, I just wanted to remind the general public that there was once a hunt for the famous or infamous Okwalinga, Steve Okwalinga, TVO. There was once a hunt for him, and what happened to him? I think up to today, the Ugandan community doesn't know who TVO is, and I think a lot of money was spent on that case. There was even a one time where a very prominent, legal mind sued Facebook to try to compel Facebook to provide the identity of TVO, and that actually never happened. But also, finally, there's a PR company that we were told was paid a lot of money to go and comb the web for any negative propaganda against the Ugandan government. I can't remember exactly off my head what that PR company was, but I think it's based in the US, and it also has offices here in London. I think it was paid quite a lot of money. I'll do my research on that next time I'm able to provide that information. But this is what I say, that I think this is it's a government in panic. They are realizing that they have lost the propaganda war, and therefore they are going to an extreme that is really not necessary. It's going to be costly, it's going to be expensive, and it may not return, very many fruits of the tree. That's my just final observation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Muswangali, Mr. Mitala Muzukuru Muswangali. Thank you so much, Dr. Stella Nyanzi Nalongo Owene, and thank you so much, Mr. Wilobo, George D. World. I want to appreciate all of you for the research that you put in, for the time that you put in, to provide people with credible information. I thank you for your time and dedication to educating our people, to having this conversation. I would like to invite each and every one of you who is watching these conversations to challenge us when we make errors so that we can correct them in a timely manner. But I would also want to thank you for following us, following these conversations. Thank you so much for following the State of the Nation. We are trying to have conversations in anticipation that they will help in liberating or in stimulating voices of reason in terms of building systems that work for the people. My name is Henry SSALI, and this is the State of the Nation.
This is the State of the Nation. We are deliberate, we are reasonable, we are uncensored. The State of the Nation with Henry SSALI.